right. This is the Urbit users group for January 2020 in Philadelphia. Now, this is a weird video thing. It's just an HTML5 thing, and you can't even see the video. But I tested it out. So here's who we got. We got 6 people, 7 including myself. So thanks everybody for coming. You will note also that I have my notes for this meeting in Urbit itself. No PowerPoint, nothing up my sleeve. And we'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. But there is now useful things you can do in Urbit. Though I'll be honest, the main thing you can do in Urbit today is talk about Urbit. It's starting to get some stuff, but that is the main app that you've got. But we'll talk about some of the cool things about even the chat app that are different. Come on in. Hey, if I can have you fill out a card with your name and your email so that I can send you something, and if you can put your name on the name tag so I can know who it is. All right, so this is going to be loosely, what we're going to do. Nope, this is everybody. This is going to be loosely. I wish I could see. This is kind of annoying. So, well, we'll hope it's a reasonable camera view here. We're going to be trying to keep to this, so that we don't go past anybody's time. But it's not super strict. I'm going to give a couple of introductory remarks. I want to find out a little more about you guys. I'm going to give a brief, 15-minute kind of high-level overview of what Urbit is. We'll talk a little bit about the controversies around Urbit, because there are some controversies around Urbit depending upon who you talk to. And I've got time for questions and for some hands-on for anybody who brought their laptops. I can shoot you out the invitations, and we can see if we can get you up and running if you would like to. So let's see if this is going to work. I haven't used one of these guys before. Well, actually, I don't need to flip to there yet. Okay, so I'm going to do a little introduction, tell you a little bit about myself and how I got involved in this thing and all that kind of jazz. So I've been a long time technologist, 32 years at this point as a professional, though I've been a coder for far longer than that. I started when I was in my early teens in the 70s. And have been, coding ever since. I have Apple II serial number 536. I still have it in my basement, and at least the last time I booted it, it's still booted up. But so I've actually been an Apple guy since the late 70s. Through all this, since Next took over Apple and all that kind of jazz. I've coded in probably almost, not crazy stuff like you, but I've coded in lots of weird languages, including I did professional assembler for a while, which if you want to pull your hair out, that's a good way to do it. I've done a number of startup companies, and then I've kind of just now I was telling some of these guys, my first startup was fairly successful, which is always a good place to get started. So then I've kind of just floated back and forth between various different opportunities. Most recently, I am now again at a startup called Delivery Circle, and we do the elevator pitch of what we do is basically it's Uber for deliveries. But it's not a full Uber model in that we only use sort of the Uber model on the demand side for the drivers. On the supply side, we actually have fixed contracts with people who know they have guaranteed deliveries every day, right? Places that have hundreds of deliveries a day. So that was kind of, and I didn't come up with this business model, but the woman who did, she was pretty smart, because a lot of people are really struggling to make the fully sort of Uber delivery model work. It's kind of hard if you don't ever know where your deliveries are coming from, right? So then the drivers get upset, because they want to know that they've got a certain number of deliveries per day, right? But anyway, so that's where I'm at right now. I'm the director of engineering there. So I actually came to Urbit through Curtis, who we're going to talk about later. But being a technologist, and he's a technologist, and so I've been associated with Urbit almost as long as it was a sort of a public thing that Curtis let other people play with. Just off and on now for years and years and years. I bought a star kind of early on, and I've just been a supporter of the project now for many years. The thing that's most exciting to me about it was what has also been sort of frustrating to me, as a technologist who's been doing this a long time, is that I find myself increasingly frustrated with the technology stacks that we have to work with, right? Particularly if you start doing JavaScript, or trying to do a mobile app and dealing with, this runs fine on Samsung Galaxy 8, but not on Galaxy 7 and stuff like this, right? So, I mean, I'm old enough that I lived the whole hype of the internet, when the World Wide Web came out and HTML and everything, because at the time I was living the hell of having all kinds of Unixes, right? Because I was a Unix guy, a Unix sysadmin, and the biggest problem back then was, that AIX wasn't the same as HPUX, and it was, that was a pain because there were like 5 of them, right? And this was going to solve this, right? And everything, it was going to be great. So now here we are now, 15 years later, and now I've got 55 of them. I don't know, right? Like I literally almost have an unknowable grid of incompatible things and layers upon layers. Every layer is another layer of crap trying to deal with the crap that's on the lower layer, right? All the security problems. I previously was at a big company, and a Fortune 200 company. I was a director of IT there, and really one of the sort of the camel, the last straw that made me like, I can't work in a big company anymore, was when the security people came to me and said, we can't let your developers install software on their computers anymore, right? Like they're going to have to like put in a ticket. We're going to revoke all their admin privileges. They're going to have to put in a ticket. Like if they want to install a new Python library or something, they're going to have to put in a ticket. Somebody from admin team is going to have to come over and install it. And it's a funny thing because you kind of understand where they're coming from, right? Because the security is situation in the current computing stacks is crap, right? And people are literally, I mean, with all the viruses and the malware and all this stuff, like, people are literally bringing companies down because I was just talking to somebody else in our industry, actually now, my new delivery industry, where a courier company is maybe going to go out of business because one of their employees brought in one of these viruses, which, locked down all of their files, right? And they've literally been, their computer systems have been down for 2 months now, and they can't recover it. Right? So long story short, like I get growing increasingly frustrated with that. The idea behind Urbit is basically, we've learned a lot, but worse, the current computing infrastructure is still running on stuff that was built in the 60s with people who were just at the very beginning even understanding what computers could do, right? We've learned a really lot about best practices, how to build better computer systems in that time. What if we tried to rebuild the whole thing literally from scratch? It's not totally from scratch, because obviously it still runs, it has a tiny bit of, you need to bootstrap it on Unix still today, and probably for a while. But there's very little there, and is it possible? And it's a crazy idea, as I always tell people. The odds of this actually working are astronomically small. That's just the truth. The Tlon guys are going to be yelling at me tomorrow for saying that. But if it does work, it would be amazing. And I don't know, for me, it's just fun to think about and to deal with and learn about the problems that entails, right? So that's kind of my pitch as to why this project is a fun project to be involved with. Not too far behind schedule. All right. So why don't we just go around the room real quick? Say your name.
My name's Chris.
Chris, and sort of just a brief background about what you do, and how did you find out about Urbit, and sort of what's your level in it? Like, how much do you know about it?
Well, I'm not in the technology industry at all.
Okay.
I do like to read.
But believe it or not, there are a lot of Urbit people who are not.
Right.
You're not alone.
But I was just thinking about where I even heard about it, and I think there might have been something on Hacker News, which I read fairly regularly. And so I've been reading the tweets and things like that, and then so I've started to read the documentation. So I have just like a brief, kind of high-level understanding of Urbit, but I don't quite understand like how I'm going to use it other than for like messaging and things like that. I mean, I understand that it's encrypted and it'll help.
Yep, go ahead.
It'll help try to mitigate some of the problems that are created by what they call the megacorp.
Yeah.
But,
yeah, that's another element of it that we can talk about. But yeah, owning your own data.
So the reason why I'm here is I'm just interested in. I understand how it's almost a pie in the sky, but it's fun to think about.
Yeah, and there have been other pie in the skies that have actually worked. Bryce?
Yeah, Bryce. I've been playing with computers since I was a kid, and like my first machine was like in probably 4th grade. The classroom had a TRS-80, and I started programming BASIC, and went from BASIC to, I bought a set of 3 books on assembly, and I learned assembly, and then I learned C, and so then throughout high school that was my hobby, and I messed with computers, and I went to school, computer science. Today I'm working at a startup company in Philly called Deduce. We're working on trying to help with certain kinds of fraud online.
Oh, wow.
That's fairly new for me. I was at IBM for like 7 years before that. And I think I learned about Urbit pretty early on. Every time one of these like greenfield like reimaginings of computing comes up, I get interested. I've always thought like Lisp is fascinating. I got exposure to that a long time ago and just love that idea. But back in the day, MIT they built hardware. Like there's hardware there's a Lisp machine. So this kind of thing is like right up my alley. So when it came along, and I just like consumed all of the stuff that Curtis wrote about anything, and I just thought there's a fascinating mind, and I really it resonated. So, and I liked the way he thought about it, and I've tried to build my own, ground up computing systems myself, and not really gotten very far. So I appreciate the struggle, right? And I heard basically him saying like it took years to get to this point, and just like really like thinking hard about all the problems.
I think
and it's easy to look at what we have today and say like, that there's a lot that's there that's like not completely obvious. So so where I am, I was kind of early on, I got gifted a couple of ships, I guess, and played around with it, and I had problems because my hardware I had at the time was like didn't have enough memory, and so I didn't go too far, and life got busy. But I've studied the documentation. I learned like a little bit about knock and who, all that, and I find it all really fascinating.
We'll touch that a little bit later.
Bradley? So I'm Bradley. I'm currently studying computer science at college. Right now I'm taking a semester off, so I'm going back in the fall. And I learned about Urbit because my dad is friends with Daryl. So he introduced me to
and I talked about it to everybody.
Yeah, so I read the website, and I'm pretty interested in seeing it work. Would be cool.
I'm Brian. I'm a programmer. I first heard about Urbit maybe 2 years ago. I don't remember when. Probably Hacker News too. At the time, I was playing around with like a Comet and going through some of the Hoon tutorials. Then I haven't really touched it in maybe 2 years until I saw their Twitter account mention this meetup. I thought it'd be cool to get back into it and see what's changed.
All right, thank you. Bryce? Or Lacey?
Lacey. My name's Lacey. I use a lot of computers and own a lot of computers, and I do it every day for work. And I this meetup was suggested to me by the meetup.com algorithm, and I believe in the algorithm. Tried to.
You bow to our AI overlords.
Well, I might as well take a sample to judge the algorithm by. Yeah. So.
All right.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, most of the interesting people I've ever met in my life made their own operating system at some point to some end. So, all ears.
Cool.
My name is Patrick. I'm a full stack web developer, build web applications. I used to work up in a startup in Cambridge for a number of years, and then I moved to Philadelphia a couple years ago. Just been doing freelance application development or web application development. I heard about Urbit, I guess, all the way back. I don't remember when, but been following along with this whole work. So I tried out when I think it first was announced on like Hacker News, or they first issued like some early planets and just played around with it. But then I kind of put it aside, and I bought a star at one point, and I haven't done anything with it.
Wow.
But so once it's a little bit more stable, I was hoping to finally like dig in and see if it's useful, because I do like the whole idea of running your own stuff. I've just moved to like running my own like Dropbox on my own self-hosting and all that, because I don't want to be my data owned by anyone else. So
nice.
I'm eager for Urbit to be actually like usable.
Cool. Andrew.
So I got into computers really young and was in hardware for years, and ended up hearing about Urbit a number of years ago. I don't remember when, but ended up switching over into weird programming, and have not really been paying attention, and am now actually in a position that I could go, okay, so what about that programming in this weird language that I heard about so many years ago? So when I saw the thing pop up on the mailing list, I was like, okay.
Nice. All right, Peter.
Makes my job easy to be the latest because it's this first section is almost identical to Bruce. Price with TRS-80 basic assembler. I'm going for computer science and all that. So I'm currently working for a company that makes tax software. I'm like software testing in that area. But I always like to experiment with new things, and that I came across that through Meetup, and then I looked it up a little bit, get a basic idea of what it is, and thought, okay, that's definitely worth pursuing a bit further. So.
All right, great. Yeah, and like I said earlier, I know most of us are computer guys, but one of the interesting things about Urbit, and I don't know exactly why this is, but Urbit actually has a lot of early adopters who were not computer people, and one of the things that I think they found actually is that sometimes non-computer programmers actually have an easier time getting into Urbit, like actually coding in Urbit, because, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, but you have to kind of unlearn a lot of things that you know because you know how programming works. But Urbit has a different approach to a lot of things, right? Being rethought from the ground up, like we discussed. All right, so I'm going to go into my overview, and please don't hesitate at any point to ask questions. I clearly have never used these things before. Not this thing. There we go. All right. But yeah, just jump in and ask questions if you have questions. You can't. This is just somewhat of a freewheeling discussion. All right, so Urbit, there's two pieces to Urbit, okay? And it's actually caused confusion, I would say, in a lot of people, because a lot of people think that Urbit is another one of these blockchain, and especially with what's been going on with blockchain, like it's another scam, and then they find out that basically it's pre-mined, if you want to call it that, and then they think, oh, it's got to be a scam, right? But the thing is that the blockchain part of Urbit is a tiny part of it, and nothing to do with the OS itself, right? We'll talk about it second, but the only thing the blockchain is used at all for is a registry of who owns which ships. That's it, right? It actually used to be hard-coded when I first started, but that obviously doesn't scale, and they didn't want that to be the case. We'll talk about that also a little bit more. But that's all that there is blockchain in Urbit. There's nothing else blockchain. It's all just regular. And Urbit is entirely written in C, right? A very mannered, highly stylistic version of C, which is actually, if you're into C at all, it's almost a primer on how to write good C, actually. But yeah, and there's really not that much code. That's kind of one of the beauties of Urbit is very explicitly from the beginning, and like somebody mentioned, I think Curtis worked on this for 10 to 12 years before he even let anybody know he was working on it, right? And from the very beginning, and I would say this is one of the things one of the reasons that keeps me engaged in this project after all these years, probably 5 or 6 years for me at this point, is even as they've grown, Tlon and the project has a real absolute commitment to they're never going to push stuff out just to push out or to get a feature or to get something done, right? The most important thing about Urbit is the cleanliness and the purity of the platform, right? Because it's explicitly designed around the idea that it's going to be sort of concentrically hardening layers, right? One of the things that Curtis wrote, this is probably like 6 or 7 years ago at the time, and it was one of the things that really also intrigued me as a computer professional, is that Urbit uses the reverse versioning of what we how we normally do versioning. Versioning normally, you put out the new version, you go from version 3 to version 4 to version 5, right? Curtis, this is one of these things. I mean, are they still going to be doing this 50 years from now? I don't know. But Urbit version numbers work in reverse, right? Such that the core, and it started, I don't know what version number it started at, somewhere in the hundreds, maybe 189 or something. And every time you make a change in the code, you have to decrement the version with the explicit idea that eventually you will no longer be allowed, or whatever, there will be no more decrements allowed. And it's he called it Kelvin versioning, and it's the idea that this thing is getting more solid and more solid as each release, and that you should be very deliberate in thinking about, are you willing to burn a version number to make this change, right? So and that each piece builds upon the outer, the inner layer, and that each layer is becoming progressively simpler and simpler, right? The kernel modules. You know what? I'm an idiot. I have one of their there's a shirt that has the entire kernel printed on it because it's very small, and I have one. There's not that many of them around. And I was going to wear it, and then I forgot. This is what happens when you get old. But anyway, but yeah, the kernel, it was always, the kernel is so small, right? You could print it on a single piece of paper, right? And that design philosophy has gone throughout the Urbit project, and it's something, at least for me, is that it makes it very nice to work with. So we talked about Urbit's clean slate, right? It's completely from the ground up, right? It does run as a VM upon Unix for now, but there's just a very small amount of VM code, and then it bootstraps itself, and everything other than this tiny kernel is written in itself in Hoon, which is the language, the new language that he created for Urbit. We'll talk a little bit later about why and what does it give you, right? Urbit, the entire operating system, is purely functional, right? Everything is a state, an operation occurs on the state, a new state of the Urbit VM exists, right? And then it's persisted, right? And it's a little bit like, I don't know if any of you guys have ever worked with AIX, the operating system AIX. It was a IBM product. It was a little, or have any of you guys ever coded in Smalltalk? All right. Well, I was a Smalltalk guy in the 90s, and it's similar to that as well, right? It always has its state, right? And if anything ever happens, it picks up exactly where it left off, right? And it's a weird thing, and we were talking a little about
like orthogonal persistence.
Exactly. Yes, it's never not persisted, and that is down to every single keystroke. Believe it or not, and it's one of the reasons why. Still, I mean, Urbit is pretty fast compared to how it used to be, but every keystroke is preserved. Even so far, this is one of the cool things when it happens. If it happens, it doesn't happen too often. But like, say you're in the chat and you're typing a chat message. Hey, how's it go? And then your Urbit crashes, right? When you restart your Urbit, it comes up with the chat, with the characters you were typing to the last character that you typed, right? It doesn't lose that input. It doesn't, right? Because every character you type is changing the state of the Urbit OS, right? And it can even be operated on, right? It's one of the things that you see it a little bit when you're in the dojo, which we may get to talk about, which is like a REPL that's inside Urbit itself. But there's a lot of things that you can imagine doing when you know everything that's being typed as it's being typed. Because a lot of times, and you'll see it happening, like I said, when you're in the REPL, you'll be trying to type something and the letter won't go. And you'll be like, what the heck? And the reason why is because it knows that is not a valid next character, right? So it won't let you type it, right? So these are some of the kind of things that you can get from this whole idea of an operating function, right? Security also being one of the main ones, right? Like you don't have the machine level attack vectors that you would have like we have today because of C and assembler and all those kind of things, right? You can't escape from that sort of functional prison, right? Now, that being said, Urbit is not securely audited yet today, right? It will be, but it's not. So you can't really consider it to be a totally secure thing like that you would want to store really important information in. Another cool thing about that is if you're familiar at all with like MIME types and things like that, or even like file extensions in operating systems, like .json, so that it knows that it's the .json. Urbit takes that to the nth degree, and it's actually formalized within the operating system, essentially in a single registry place, so that you can essentially know that if you get this, I don't want to say file, they're not really files, but if you get this past this structure, I guess is the best way to think about it, and they're called marks in Urbit, right? If it's marked that this thing is JSON, then the OS is actually guaranteeing you that this thing is JSON, right? So there's security things like that built into the system itself, because those are some of the places where, you know, leakages come in, right, in our current system. You know, someone says they're passing you this, but they're actually passing you that. And if you're not careful, you got a virus. Everything in Urbit is message based. It's all message passing. You get a message, you respond to a message, you send a message, right? Urbit is fundamentally distributed, which is another one of the really exciting things about it. Is when you're writing an application in Urbit, it is automatically a networked application, and all of the application infrastructure is built to build distributed applications. Because back to the whole identity thing and megacorp and everything, right? Urbit very explicitly rejects the idea of there ever being a central server, right? Everything is on the basis of peers talking to each other, right? That leads to some really interesting challenges and ways to think about things, but because it's baked in from the beginning, I'm a big believer that Urbit is going to be an amazing platform on which to build truly decentralized applications and build them really easily, because all the plumbing that we have to do to try to build a distributed application is just in there, right? You don't have to worry about how do people subscribe to me. It's all built in, right? So, and we touched on VM. So the second piece of Urbit is the Urbit ID, and that's your identity, right? And that's tied to the fact that one of the features of Urbit, and this is, I guess I could have put this in the controversy section. One of the features of Urbit is that part of the problem on the internet today is complete anonymity, right? The fact that you can be completely anonymous and you can coin essentially infinitely number of new identities is what leads to a lot of the badness of the internet, because the bad guys can just pop up, you know, in another place with a new identity. You don't know he's a bad guy, and there's no way to gain victory in that whole whack-a-mole contest. So Urbit very explicitly, you are tied to a specific identity. Now that specific entity doesn't have to be tied to your physical meat space identity if you don't want it to be. I mean, most people in Urbit don't have a problem with telling people what their Urbit ID is. I am, if you've been on Urbit, and you may have seen me, I'm Winter Patches. That's my planet, right? I do also have a star, Darler. And we'll talk about those in a second. But this is your identity, and this is actually just an integer as well, right? There's just an algorithm in Urbit built into the OS which converts integers into these mnemonic names. And believe it or not, they worked a lot on this. This was not that easy to do, because these are syllables, right? That's an H. case that wasn't obvious. And there's only a certain number of them, right? Because the whole idea, who owns this integer, this name, is stored on the Ethereum blockchain, right? And they picked Ethereum for various reasons. I think it seemed to be the best choice when they did it. I know there's some people who are agitating to move it to Bitcoin. Ethereum was programmable at the time, and I think Bitcoin wasn't. I am not a big blockchain guy. I know enough to work my Urbit stuff with Ethereum. But the big difference between Urbit, right? If Bitcoin and Ethereum are like digital money, the idea of Urbit is that it's digital land. And that's why it has a fixed identity and a fixed number as well, right? So that there is scarcity built in to the system, right? There are, so it starts at the top. Hang on. And they're called ships because the first version of Urbit that Curtis put out into the world did not have this solar system metaphor. It had a Navy metaphor where what our galaxies now were carriers and there were battleships, and that's why they were ships. And that's why your directory that holds your ship is called a pier. If you hear people call it a pier, that's because it was the ship metaphor, that was the pier. And somehow those never got changed. I like to call these things starships, but they're not all stars, so that doesn't really work either. Spaceships, maybe. So it's an explicit hierarchy where there are galaxies at the top. There are 256 galaxies, okay? And the galaxies issue all of the other ships, right? The galaxies are owned by various people who they've been given to. Talon, who's the company who sponsors Urbit, owns a lot of them. Curtis owns a bunch of them. He gave a bunch of them away, But part of what they're trying to do with Urbit is distribute ownership as well, right? So they're not trying to hold ownership, closely held to a small number of people. Because the idea is, the more it's out there, the more you can get variety. And I really think they imagine a world one day, if Urbit takes off, where galaxies will have their own personalities potentially. Stars will have their own personalities. They might have communities around them that they foster a particular type of person would want to be associated with this star or whatever, right? So, like I said, there's 256 galaxies. Each galaxy can issue 256 there's 65,000 stars. It's 256 times 256. And then the stars are the last layer that are sort of considered the network infrastructure, right? If you own a galaxy or a star and it's running, you're considered to have an obligation to keep it up in a similar way that, like a network provider would do here. Because as we were talking about earlier, if I issue you, and I'm going to issue you guys some planets from my star tonight, the very first time, if you go to boot that planet, and my star isn't online, it's going to fail, right? So I have an obligation to try to keep my star up and running so that the other thing that happens is all the planets. So the planet is, and there's 4 billion planets, 4.3 billion planets, right? That attach to stars. Each star can issue 65,000 planets. That's the server unit that most people own, right? That's this winter patches, and that's, you'll see everybody, most people, that's what they run. So I said, so the first time you have to communicate with your star, and then you get updates to the operating system come in over the network, right? So that, I didn't talk about this, but it's fully updatable while it's running, right? And that's how they distribute network updates, right? Those come in through your star as well. So if your star's not up, you're not going to get the latest patch when they put it out. So there's an obligation if you're at the star level or the galaxy level that you're actually running this thing and keeping it alive. Whereas your planet, you can do, the planet can run on a lot of different things. A lot of people run them in the cloud. I run one on, I guess I run my star on DigitalOcean. I run my planet on Linode. You can run it on a $5 a monther. It does require, you have to allocate 2 gigs of memory when it boots, but you can do that with swap. So, and there's lots of tutorials to show you how to do that. But you can run it on your laptop as well, right? And then when you shut your laptop down, now you're not in communication. But because all the messages are, the message-based system is exactly once delivery, which is actually a really cool thing, and it's very hard to do. And it's one of the things that, to me, they're still working out the kinks, because exactly once delivery is not easy. You'll just get all the messages that happen while you had your laptop shut, right? You'll just pick right up where you left, and then any messages you have will come in. So so you don't have to run your planet in the cloud, or it doesn't have to be up and running at all times. Though I do it, and like I said, it's $5 a month, so it's not bad. Planets can issue moons, and there's, I forget what it was. So every planet can issue 18 quintillion moons. And because once again, it's just an integer, it's just a bigger byte number. The idea of moons is that the moons are eventually going to be like the network of our Internet of Things kind of idea, like devices, right? Or your refrigerator will be running a moon, in the Urbit maximalist idea. If one day everything is Urbit, right? So, but moons are tied to a particular planet. I think I mentioned it earlier. Planets are not tied to the star that issued them. They can, become free and move to any other star that will accept them, right? The final element are comets. Some of you guys said you're familiar with comets. There are whatever 18.4 quintillion times 18.4 quintillion is. Very big number. And comets are just completely throwaway, free-floating entities. Anybody can boot one up at any time. But they're generally considered untrusted, right? So that you can block them, and there are things already that they can't do. And I have heard people mentioning wanting to just get rid of them, but I don't know. At some level, it's nice to have a completely throwaway. There's one cool thing that you can do, and I highly recommend this if you do start trying to program in your Urbit. You can spin up a what's called a fake Zod locally on your laptop, which is basically a non-network connected planet. If you're just playing with it, right? Zod is, and I didn't mention this, Zod is 0, right? There is one galaxy that is privileged above all the other galaxies, Galaxy 0, and its name is Zod, right? So, which of course, I guarantee you that was meant to have lots of, help me Zod, all those kind of silly things. There's a lot of weird stuff like that in Urbit. But yeah, so that's kind of how the network hierarchy works and the different levels. All right. Oh man, I'm going too long. My plans all flamed. All right, so I won't talk too long about these controversies. So we addressed a little bit about the scarcity. One thing that people get freaked out about when they get to Urbit is, oh my God, there's only 4.3 billion planets. What's going to happen when they run out? It's like, well, there's about 615 in regular operation today. I think you're jumping the shark a little bit. One, but two, it is a key part of Urbit, the fact that they're scarce, right? A lot of Urbit is built around the ability to ban planets, right? And stars, and it's built in that whole networking infrastructure that I told you about, right? Because the whole idea of Urbit is that one of the things that makes human society work, and all right, I'm on an editorial rant here a little bit, so just to be clear, this is Daryl's opinion, but one of the reasons why the social media and online is so deeply broken to me is because there is no identity, right? And in contrast to the real world, right? Where if Bryce comes up to me and he says, Daryl, you're freaking, this was the worst meetup I've ever gone to. You're a jerk. I hate you. Right? Well, he's fine to say that, and I can even respect him. But it's tied to him, right? And I can respond to that and deal with that and say, all right, Bryce, you're banned from the Urbit meetup if I'm a real dictator type guy, right? Whereas in social media, you don't have that, right? And it was the contention of Curtis and that's a recipe for bad behavior, right? And that was one of the things that he was hoping, that you could have a community that, if your reputation is going to follow you around because you're, oh man, that Winter Patches, he's a dick, right? He can be banned, right? Now, today, right, for $10, I can, become Hosnev Rosler, which is my other plan, right? But it still costs me $10, right? It costs me $0 to get another Twitter identity, right? So the scarcity is it. Some people don't like it. Some people don't like that you have that sort of thing that you're tied to an identity, but it's part of the platform, and it's not going anywhere. And it's not because of like neo-feudalism or anything like that. That's opaqueness. you'll see once you start getting into Urbit that all kinds of things, that words that you thought you knew what they were, they have new words for them. The programming language Hoon is really weird when you look at it the first time. I'm just going to be honest. It's, it's like, whoa, what the heck is this? It has runes. It has weird syntax. It doesn't call things, right? Like functions are called gates, right? You have arms and legs in structures. Like there's lots of stuff that's not what programmers call it. And mostly though, that's for a purpose, right? If you're building something completely from scratch and new, there is loaded baggage with words that people have an idea of what they mean. So the idea in Urbit was, if this thing is kind of like this thing, but it's not exactly like this thing, I don't want to give it the same name, right? So that people have the wrong impression, right? Better to give it a different name. You learn from the beginning that it's different, and then you go from there, right? One of the cool things about Urbit is, back to the whole no state thing, right? There's no environment in Urbit, right? Urbit has this thing called the subject, which is you can think of it as, it's, I guess in that weird kind of Python way, it's this thing that's passed into every gate that you have in your system, but that you can't reach out. There's nothing out there. Everything is always fully known within the context of what you're executing. And so there's things around that are unusual, and there's other things that the variable addressing goes backwards of what you would normally think, like in most languages, A dot B is, this is the instance, and this is the method or the index, that's part of the structure you're accessing. In Urbit, it's backwards, right? This is the thing in the subject, and this is the sub thing that you're accessing. So there's a lot of that in there. All right. So, you kind of got to look at it and make your own judgment. There's a really good, and I'm going to send out links to everybody who was here. There's a really good write-up on that talks about a lot of why this is, right? Because it's mainly because they're trying to build something that's never been built before, a completely functional OS and totally networked message passing operating system. So they had to come up with concepts that work differently than how our current computers work. This one is probably to some people the most controversial, and to my knowledge, it's the only one that Curtis says that he did wrong. Is in Urbit 0 is true. So that causes a lot of people to kind of freak out. I mean, once you get used to it, it's fine. I mean, his rationale for it was, as a C embedded programmer, and any of you guys who are longtime C programmers, when a function returns 0, that's success, right? Because you can only impute information if all you've got is an integer return value. The only way you can't impute any information into 0. So if 0 was failure state, you're done, right? But if 0 is success and anything except 0 is error, now you can communicate infinite number of non-success ideas, right? So anyway, but that's another one that's controversial. Curtis says he wish he did it the other way, just because it's been such a pain. Finally, Curtis himself. I don't know how much you guys know about him, but if you go online about the Urbit project, you're going to read about how he's a Nazi and he's a white nationalist and he thinks that we should reinstate slavery and all this kind of jazz. Once again, my opinion, but maybe Bryce can back me on. I think that's all a load of bunk, right? It's all cherry-picked things. Is he a person who thinks incredibly outside the box for normal today's level of political correctness? Yes, he's a wild thinker. All his writings are up at unqualifiedreservations.com. He was a blogger for many years. They're long, right? Like he probably wrote. How long is How Dawkins Got Pwned? It's got to be 15,000 words, 20,000 words. He wrote this huge 4-part series on how basically Richard Dawkins thinks he's an atheist, but he's just a reformed Christian. And that's why it's How Dawkins Got Pwned. But so he's written a lot of stuff that you have to think about. And a lot of people these days don't like to think, quite frankly, in my opinion. He's not associated with the project anymore, right? He doesn't code on the project anymore. He doesn't, if he really bothers you, that is what it is. But he doesn't code. He does still own a lot of the Urbit space in terms of galaxies and such. But I would encourage you to read what he wrote, because I think you'll see it is incredibly more nuanced than, like I said, literally these people are taking one sentence out of a 5,000 word essay and saying, oh my God, he's a white nationalist, or whatever. Right? Even though he even has a whole essay on why I'm not a white nationalist, because he's not. He's actually, in many ways, he's a fairly liberal guy. So that's controversies. Are there questions about that? I just thought it comes up in the forums. Don't bring it up on Urbit Help. I think there's a new discussion group for it, for conspiracy theory. And I think that's all I have. Yeah, questions.
I guess I was curious if you had been paying attention to how the stars are supposed to work and all that. You said the star has to be online. So,
if it's issued planets.
So I guess the question is: so once the is there any incentive, for the stars to stay online? Because that seems like a burden for the star owner to perpetually be internet infrastructure if you're not getting paid, right?
Yeah. Well, I think there's the thought that a star could potentially provide services to its planets, could potentially ask its planets to pay. A star can sell its planets. There is currently right now a site called Urbit Live that lets you, so you could take your star, you give them the right to spawn planets for you. And then they give you a cut of how much they make selling your planets.
But when someone buys that planet, does my star have to be online, or else their planet?
It does the first time. So yes, you would be considered not a good person to sell planets. But trust me, so there's two ways you can buy planets right now. You can buy them on Urbit Live. Now, buying on Urbit Live is generally a good experience, right? Every planet that I've seen and people and I follow their Telegram and most the stars that are selling planets on Urbit Live are generally there, and your star will boot up. The other place you can buy planets, and they're cheaper is on OpenSea. Right? If you're familiar with OpenSea, it's like a place where you can buy stuff that costs digital money. Weird stuff too, but also Urbit planets. That's a more hit and miss because there are people selling planets on OpenSea, usually for only like $2 or $3, but the star isn't running. So my star will be running. Like I said, I was really nervous because there was a bug that was causing my star to crash every hour until yesterday, and they fixed it.
Does the galaxy that your star comes from has to be running too?
For my star to boot up the first time, yes, and then to get updates, yes. And the interesting thing is you can't tell from the name of a planet. They're scrambled, and you can't tell what star it's from. Right? Winter Patches is actually it's not even from my star. Its star is Binzad, and there's a command that you can use to figure that out. What was I going to say? Darlur though is Lur. Stars you can always tell. The second part of the star is the galaxy. So Binzad is a child of Zod. And it's owned by Tlon, which is a good one to have as a parent. Because they generally keep them up, though not always. I mean, they're busy guys. The community in Urbit is really a good community. I mean, it's one of the things that I enjoy most about it is, you're in a community of technologists who are fairly excited about the technology, and it's fun. As I said, it legitimately is true that the main thing you can do in Urbit right now is talk about Urbit in the chat. The chat's very good. And I can maybe show, I wish this room doesn't have a projector, but I'll try to show on the laptop here a little bit. But there is other stuff you can do. Like I said, the notes for this presentation were all entirely within Urbit. So you aren't going to be able to see this great. And you know what? I'm going to turn this video off. I just made everybody sick on the video as I spun that around. I'm going to,
Good way to wrap it up.
goodbye. I'm going to turn the video off.